This is Austin Liddy Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. Kerri Schlottman grew up outside of Detroit, Michigan. Kerri wrote her first book called Idioms when she was only 7 years old and continued to create stories through the years, publishing them in cardboard covers with wallpaper scraps. She went on to self-publish 3 novels since 2012, while also working full-time as an arts administrator, a career she still enjoys today.
Welcome to the show, Kerri Schlottman.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So I read your novel, Tell Me One Thing, which will be out in a few weeks, which I'm sure feels very exciting.
Yes, very exciting.
So it explores the lives of 2 women. So there's Quinn and there's Lulu. And Quinn takes a Polaroid of Lulu when she's a little girl. It's kind of a provocative shot where she's sitting on a trucker's lap smoking a cigarette. Can you talk about the impetus, like the initial nugget of the idea for this novel for you?
Yeah, sure. So this book is actually inspired by a real life photograph, different kind of photograph, but similarly provocative, that was taken by Mary Ellen Mark in 1990 in rural North Carolina. So Mary Ellen was, she died in 2015, but she was sort of a renowned photo documentarist. And she had been sent on assignment, I think it was by Life magazine, to document kids in a school for troubled children. And so she had met the subject of her photo, Amanda. So she has this photo called Amanda and her cousin Amy. The content of the photo is 2 girls in a kiddie pool. Amanda is sort of the main feature of the photograph, and she's 9 years old. She's standing very provocatively, hand on a hip, and she's smoking a cigarette. She has makeup on, fake nails, and her cousin Amy sits in the back down in the pool. And it's a really shocking photograph. It's not staged. Mary Ellen never staged any of her work. And I studied that photograph. I studied art history when I was in college. So I studied that photograph and I thought about it constantly after I had seen it. And then in 2015, when Mary Ellen passed away, NPR found the subjects of that photo, in particular Amanda. So she was in her late 30s at the time, and they interviewed her and asked her why she allowed herself to be photographed. And she said that she had such a hard life, like in and out of foster care, in and out of different kinds of, getting the school for troubled children. She was in juvenile detention at some point. So she thought someone would see that photograph and come and help her. And when I heard that interview, it was just heart-wrenching, especially working in the arts. I spent my whole career working in the arts. And so I know these conversations happen about responsibility around some of this kind of photography. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of intervention that happens. And so I heard that interview. It wasn't in 2015. I heard it a couple of years later when NPR resurfaced it. And my husband and I were leaving New York City to drive to see his family in Pittsburgh. And we had just heard this really sort of shocking story. And then we stopped to get gas in this very small town in rural Pennsylvania. And it was kind of like this light bulb went off. And I thought, I'm going to write a fictionalized version of this story, but I'm going to tell both of those sides of the story. And so that's how the book came about. So I started writing it in 2018. And now here we are 5 years later, and it's finally coming out, which I'm really excited about.
I know, publishing just takes so long, doesn't it?
It's no joke.
It's like a glacial pace. So that will lead me to my next question. So Gwen feels a lot of guilt throughout the novel. She thinks about Lulu quite a bit, although she doesn't really do anything about it for a while. And then Lulu often thinks of Gwen. She thinks that she's glamorous and all these type of things. And it doesn't take till much later for the 2 threads of that story to come together. But now that you know that you're far away from having written this book, which character do you feel like you relate with more?
That's a good question.
they both are taken advantage of quite a bit, even though their circumstances are totally different. And, maybe that's because of inexperience or lack of money. But which character do you feel like now that you feel like you relate to more?
It's fascinating because I feel like, so I grew up in Southeast Detroit, kind of on the fringe of a small town in a very economically challenged place, to a single mother, not in the kind of circumstance that Lulu's in the book, but a lot of challenges. And then I moved to New York City in 2005, and it was like this culture shock, of having these two worlds. And so I feel like I still carry them with me. I mean, I still go home constantly to see family. So I still am very much steeped in that kind of the Lulu-esque side of things, while I'm literally living in, the kind of setting that Quinn was living in. So I think that at different times I identify with both of them. I think that, especially having worked in the arts, but then having come from this background that was really challenging, I think that they both live in me in a certain way. And I think that's why this book was important for me to write, because I struggle with that. I struggle a lot with, like, there's such different worlds and they don't know each other very well, these two worlds. And so, the book let me think through that and kind of immerse myself in both of their stories in a way that I kind of needed to myself, to understand my own life and my own position of kind of straddling these two really different cultures.
Right. I remember when I was first reading about your book, and I thought, such a fascinating idea, what happened to these characters before and after a photograph, because, I'm sure, I always think about that when I see an interesting shot, and I'm like, who are these people and what's their life like? And, and the fact that this photo became such a huge hit in the art scene, and then Lulu's suffering, back where she's from, it's a very interesting thing to kind of think about. So I imagine it was an interesting time for you to write this story. There were a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, and I think that what you're hitting on is exactly kind of what I was needling at in the book. I really love social documentary photography of all the art forms. I think it's one of the most interesting because it is real people, and the history of it is so fascinating, and the way that, it kind of emerged in a time to make a case to support people who were living in challenging situations. That's actually how it kind of emerged in this country. And now it's in collections in major museums. And I have a hard time with that idea, that when it crossed over into fine arts, I don't know what happens there, and I wrote this whole book and explored this idea, and I still don't know how I feel about it, because I do think it gives it wider exposure in certain ways. But I think it takes out some of the feeling of the social impact opportunity that, this photography has. But I am totally fascinated by it too. And again, I think it's because, yeah, you're just getting a snapshot of a particular moment with real people. And I think as writers, this is really fascinating, right? Like a story being told in a photograph, because I'm sure you probably look at this stuff like I do, because you're a writer, and you're like, your brain goes, wild with all the stories about what was happening in that moment, what happened before it, what happens after it. And I think that that's what makes that photography really powerful. Mm-hmm. And also potentially problematic, because, yeah, this is, someone is benefiting off of that photography being taken when it crosses, especially into this sort of fine arts setting, and into private collections. You have private collectors who have acquired this work as well. So I played around a bit with how I feel about that in the book. It's a little challenging because it's also through the perspective of an artist who is really financially struggling. And I think that that's a real challenge too. How do you make that kind of work in a capitalist society, in an art market? And one of the reasons why I set this book, beginning in the 80s, is because that was really the emergence of the commercial art market, mm-hmm. which really started to change how artists related to their subjects, how artwork was viewed, especially now. It's kind of fascinating. And Quinn talks about this a little bit in the book. But it's a conversation I love to have with people, just about, like, now in 2023, how much that has even exploded even further. You have investment bankers who are collecting artwork just so it can sit in a closet so that it can gain, it can gain value. So these things this is a big deal. And I think that when it comes to social work, it's a huge, huge, potentially problematic thing.
Right. I was reading an article about Basquiat recently, and was saying that most of his artwork people haven't seen it because it's not out in the public. And then, what his life was like and how he was treated. And it is pretty interesting. When he was coming up in the 80s, as well as Keith Haring and a lot of those other folks who all of a sudden their work became like these huge commodity.
Absolutely. And sometimes it was after they were no longer alive. So, that's also an interesting idea. They didn't get to benefit from some of this in their lifetime. They, most of these artists struggled for their whole lifetimes, or, even when you achieve sort of a level of fame like Quinn does in the book, it doesn't necessarily mean financial freedom or stability. Right. That's just the reality of the creative life.
Right. So I was really interested in seeing how your two timelines would come together. When I see that kind of stuff in work, I'm always like, okay, I'm going to see how this plays out. It's very interesting for me. So when you were writing this book, did you have it planned out pretty well? Did you kind of just go with it to see how it would end up? What was the process like to make it come together?
So I tend to be a fly by the seat of my pants writer, for better or worse, although I'm learning how to get better at making outlines. With this book in particular, though, I knew what I wanted to happen. And so I just wrote it. I didn't outline. I didn't decide what each chapter would do. And so, what that inevitably means is that I had to do a lot of revision and clean out redundancies and whatnot after that. But for this one, I just needed it to flow out. I knew enough about both of these characters going into it, because again, like, I feel like I straddle both of their worlds, that I felt pretty confident in just flowing out the narrative. And then I went back and cleaned it up. And it actually had a fairly different structure when I initially finished it. And my editor and I worked together to kind of get it into the format that it's in now. But I had it much more interweaving initially, which, ultimately didn't give us quite the sustained amount of time we needed with both of the characters individually to feel the connection to them that I think is important in the book. Now that I've gone through this process of revision and what I'm working on now, I am doing what I call a chapter map, because I don't like the word outline. So I'm just keeping track now in a much better way about what, as I'm writing, like what's happening in each chapter. I still let it flow, but now I'm taking notes sort of at the end of the day of writing. I'm like, okay, chapter 1's about this, because, you go back and then you eventually kind of you can get lost in your own book trying to really organize thinking in it. So yeah, I'm getting more disciplined.
I've talked to so many writers about this, and this is probably one of the most interesting conversations for me, because I've met very few that just champion the outline. There's either folks that are like, nope, I don't have any notes and I just pants it out, which, okay. And then there's folks that talk about, the bare skeleton outline. And then there's folks that I've talked to that pantsed out a novel and then went back and outlined afterwards, which sounds super frustrating to me. I learned outlining with my novel To Squeeze a Prairie Dog, because before that, I just pantsed out stories and got really frustrated. And I had gotten to a point after, I guess that was my sixth novel, after doing quite a few, of being frustrated, of wanting to just throw everything out the window and say, I'm going to try to do this a totally different way. And now I love to outline. And I think some people get kind of, the assumption of what the outline means is not correct. I think what a lot of people think about of an outline is maybe like some kind of business plan or something, but my outline is actually very bare bones. But basically it says, okay, in this chapter, these two things have to happen. Whatever else I write is up to me. But these two things have to happen for the story to kind of go forward. And so that gives me enough room to sit down in, a couple writing sessions to have as much fun as I want, as long as those two things happen. That's just an example, right?
I think that's fantastic. I mean, I feel like that's what I'm doing now. And I find it so much more productive with my, you can call it a chapter map too. It's a nicer way for mentally, you feel good about calling things not out. But it's been so helpful, because then I can also go back and say, I can just reorganize, you reorganize it within your map, and then you just move those chapters. I remember at some point in editing, Tell Me One Thing, when we were deep in the edits of it, I had my living room was just covered in paper, because I kept, reading it and moving stuff and physically moving it around. And I was like, I have to get a better system. This is not, this is going to take me like really go nuts. So I am a firm believer in it too now. And I agree. I think like, sometimes for me, I don't know yet what's gonna like enough of what I want to happen, until the characters really start to live together and do things together. And then I think, okay, and then I'll do what you're talking about too. Sometimes I'll just make notes and say at some point, I want these things to happen. And then I can figure out, where within the rest of the plot and narrative I want that to take place. But I'm a convert. I for sure, like now that I've done it, I'm like, okay, I can't believe this is my 5th book I've written. And so I pantsed all the other ones and I can't even believe that now.
Yeah. Because as well, I'm speaking for myself, but as I get older, I've found that I've been more prolific than when I was younger. And I think a lot of it has to do with organizing and preparing for work and then sitting down and being able to create it in a certain amount of time. That's not 5, 6, 7 years, where I can write a first draft in 6 months. I've done 3 or 4 novels, first drafts in 6 months, and that's a short amount of time compared to when I was first writing, which, it was years. But I find like as I get older that being prepared, I feel better about sitting down and like, okay, I'm going to be productive today.
Yeah, I think that's totally it. And I feel like, well, also I think when you are more prolific, you want to be more organized about it too. I feel like I'm a fairly speedy first draft writer. And then I will spend probably a year revising.
Yeah.
So I can do the same. I can do my first draft in about 6 months if I know exactly what I'm aiming to do with the book. Sometimes it's a little longer if I'm like giving myself the luxury of figuring something out within a narrative. But the revision is where I like to spend a lot of time in revising, almost maybe to a fault where at some point I'm like, you just have to stop, and feel confident that it's ready to share. But there's something really wonderful about having that first draft done and knowing like kind of the hardest part of the book is done. Like you got it all out there and now you get to play with it and mold it and out some of the, other aspects of it that you maybe didn't come out in that first iteration.
Right. Yeah, that's my favorite part too. So now that you have a book getting ready to come out, what are some things that you've learned about this entire publishing process that was kind of a surprise that you didn't know about before?
There's so many things. I think the timeline is one, like we mentioned. I remember a long time ago, I was in a writing workshop, and it was an agent panel, and they were talking about, it usually takes about 5 years from the time you've written, from the time you start writing a book until it actually gets published. And at the time, I thought, no way, that's so long, 5 years, and then it's kind of right, like it takes a lot of time. So that was my first surprise, even when the book got acquired, which I was so excited about. The publication date was set for 2 years after that point. And I thought that's an eternity, and then it goes by really quickly. You have so many things to do. So that was my first big surprise. I think, at least for me, I'm working with an independent publisher and they're fantastic. They're very hands-on, but there's a lot expected of the author. And I think, my previous work that I'd published, I had self-published with the help of, small group of friends who were designers, proofreaders, that sort of thing. So it was all that timeline was my own control. With this one, it was, and all the work of that was my own control. I think with this, some of the surprise around just how much I have to be involved with things like the marketing, the PR, the book events, getting all these things organized. My publisher does some of that, but not a whole lot of it, and because they're small and they don't have a lot of resources for that. So I'm in that moment right now of, trying to figure out my events and like convince bookstores to carry it and that sort of thing. I didn't ever think I'd be doing that. And it's definitely not my comfort zone. So I'm learning how to work around the things that I'm uncomfortable doing in promoting work, and also just learning like how it all works, how distribution works, how bookstores make their selections, all of these things that I don't know if authors realize that you will learn all of that when you publish your book, and you'll have to get good at it.
Right. Yeah. I still talk to some authors that have this fantasy that they're just going to write and do nothing else. It's like their dream. And it's like, it's like starting a business and then doing nothing. At least nowadays, it's really difficult with so many other things getting people's attention besides books, to just write a book and then not do anything at all.
Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right. And I mean, even with the ones I had self-published, I didn't really do much to market them or promote them. For me, I still have a pretty active career in the arts. And so, writing it was more of a hobby until more recently. And so with those books, I was just fortunate that people liked them. And then through word of mouth, book clubs picked them up and some things just happened. And I thought, oh, that's great. I didn't really have to depend on them doing well. That circumstance is changing a bit, which is also kind of one of those moments, I think, for authors where when you are getting more attention for your work and you're putting more emphasis on it, then the stakes are higher. I'm feeling the pressure of the stakes being higher now. I'm like, I want this book to do well. I want people to relate to it. I want the message of it to really get out there. And that's a pressure, that feels different than the other stuff I published.
All right, so now's the time in our show where we do the lightning round. It's an idea that we stole from inside the Actors Studio, but it's not their idea. They stole it from Bernard Pivot. He stole it from Marcel Proust. So Kerri Schlottman, are you ready for the lightning round?
I'm ready. Oh, it's made me nervous. Okay, I'm ready.
All right, what's your favorite word?
Delicious.
Okay. What's your least favorite word?
Financial.
Yeah, I agree. What turns you on?
Laughter.
And what turns you off?
Aggressiveness.
Okay. What is your idea of happiness?
Writing.
Excellent. Who is your favorite author?
Rebecca Makkai.
Very nice. All right. So if you could be any character from a well-known novel throughout history, who would that be?
Honestly, I think one of those Harry Potter kids. I feel like that would be super fun. Like the good ones, not the evil ones in the book, but like the ones who do good things.
Right. Excellent. So what profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
Oceanographer. I still want to be an oceanographer. I went really wrong somewhere a long time ago.
Jacques Cousteau. All right. What profession would you least want to do?
Like a banker. Ugh,
yeah.
No shade on the bankers out there, but yeah, not for me.
Right. Okay. Last question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
Oh, you can relax now.
Very nice. All right, Kerri Schlottman, your book, Tell Me One Thing, comes out the end of January 2023. Everybody go out and buy it. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liddy Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.